You are listening to a Sunday morning message from River Corner Church. We are a simple community of Jesus followers in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Learn more at rivercornerchurch.com.
Well, this morning we're going to be looking at a passage that we probably have looked at in the time that I've been here before. And it's a passage that I personally love to look at every year, multiple times. And so we're going to be looking at Luke 8, 40 through 50. And as I said, this is one of my favorite passages to spend time with each year. It's a story to me of Jesus that really stands out in the way that he learns to be interruptible and present and affirming of other people. It is one of those stories that has so many different angles and feels that cause us to reflect and wrestle with what's going on in our own lives that I don't think can ever be exhausted. It truly teaches me each year as I read it to be a person who's interruptible and to be present with those people that we see in the moments of our lives, often in the shadows of our lives. But it also causes me to wrestle with some of the emotions that I deal with sometimes. Emotions when I feel like other people are winning and I'm still struggling with something. And so no matter how many times I read this passage, I love it. It seems to reveal another layer. There's always something that catches my attention. And as you know, our key verse this year is Hebrews 10:24, which addresses how we can encourage each other towards Jesus. And encouragement is the action or the glue of a healthy covenant community of Messianic or Jesus followers. And part of what we're doing is learning to pay attention to how Jesus himself encouraged people, and then how to encourage other people like Jesus did. And so that's kind of going to be the lens by which we're reading this passage in Luke 8 today, is this lens of how did Jesus encourage people, and how can we, like Jesus, encourage others with each other, but also with the world around us in the places that we live, that we work, that we worship, and that we play. We want to encourage people into those places in good ways that they for themselves are drawn and discover Jesus. And so my hope this year and this morning as we open this passage is that this passage will give something to you, and it might not even be anything that I have planned, but you'll find something in it that will help shape you and help shape me as we discover this year of encouragement. I'm going to be reading out of the New International Version. I'm going to stop as I read through it and just unpack a few things that really stood out to me this week as I read it. Luke 8, 40 through 50 reads like this. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a moment. The word for expecting here is that they were anticipating, or that they had expectations for his return. Somehow through the grapevine, I heard it through the grapevine, right? One of my favorites, California Raisins, did a great cover of it. Okay? They knew he was coming to town. And he's been doing some pretty miraculous signs and wonders. There's been healings. And so they come, the Greek implies, with anticipation or expectation on him. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's just important to notice that everyone's coming with their own agenda. And then there's a man named Jairus. He's a synagogue leader or a ruler. He's the senior pastor of a church. He's the main facilitator. And he came and he fell at Jesus' feet. Now, we use the word fell, but it's actually he laid prostrate on the ground. And there's a word there that implies before it that he quickly did it, that he moved with immediacy, that the minute he saw Jesus, he threw himself down on the ground in an act of worship. And he pleads with him, or begs with him, to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. The NIV does the best translation of this. Literally, the crowd is enveloped over them and is pushing them under their weight. There was a concert some years ago of an 80s band called Great White that they're famous because their concert venue was overpacked and the people literally in an evacuation crushed each other. Yesterday when we were at the Pennsylvania Farm Show, there was a fire alarm going off, and someone got over the radio and said, "Please do not evacuate. You don't need to evacuate." I didn't even hear the alarm, so I didn't need to hear that alarm. Once I heard that we didn't need to evacuate, I thought maybe I should be evacuating, right? In this story here, they have come with so much agenda on Jesus, they're crushing him. And a woman was there who had been a subject of bleeding for 12 years. But no one could heal her. She's been through every kind of doctor appointment there is. They've tried herbs. They've tried prayers. She's exhausted her own prayers. There's no spiritual or physical answer for what she's dealing with. And that is what the word there implies. No one could heal her. And Luke uses that word intentionally, heal, because he's setting up for what needs to happen. There are times in our lives where we are so physically and spiritually exhausted that we can only be dependent on Jesus. That it's only if God comes through, and that's what's happening here. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Now, I had intended to carry my Jewish prayer shawl with me, a tallit, and show you something. The word here sometimes gets translated edge or hem, depending on what version you're reading out of. We think of it as where the clothes get sewed together, and it could be that. But the other implication here is that if you picture a Jewish rabbi or even a Jewish gentleman who has the tassels on the side of his undershirt or on his prayer shawl, they're kind of these long, flowy strings or yarn pieces that when I have mine on, I can't feel if someone's touching it or not. And so we get this idea that all she can do is reach up and touch the tassel. And the bleeding immediately stops. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. And when they all denied it, the whole crowd, right? Peter says, "Master, the people are crowding, they're just pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that the power has gone out of me." Now, I know, and we don't have a great translation for this, but what Jesus is saying is, I know in otherworldly ways. We as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we confess that Jesus was fully God and also fully human. That Jesus is God in the flesh, but he came to live the life that we lived. And we say that he lived out of his humanity to show us the way, that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so something peculiar is happening for Luke here. Luke, in hindsight, in writing it, realizes something really important. Jesus is God. And he's accessing his divinity side here. His divine side. He's saying, someone touched me, I know. The word know there means I perceive through other methods. I don't just feel. There's something otherworldly letting me know that God is doing something in a moment. And I know the power, the healing power of God, the miraculous power has gone out from me. Then a woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling, and she fell at his feet. Notice the contrast here, by the way. The crowd has come to Jesus with expectations. Jairus has come to Jesus with expectations, and he throws himself in a begging fashion of worship at Jesus' feet. But this woman just musters up enough strength to touch his tassel, believing that her actions will be enough. She's not bringing her expectations. She's not bringing her begging. She knows that if she can just touch it, she knows, she perceives. Same thing Jesus is doing here in otherworldly ways. And we see this kind of, as she falls at his feet, the crowd, I think everyone started to back off Jesus at that point. As Jesus said, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" And Peter's like, "Come on, man, you know the farm show's busy. This place is busy. The market is busy. Everyone's just bumping and grinding on each other. We just got to keep moving." And Jesus said, no, something happened. And the crowd starts to go, "Whoa, it wasn't me. Wasn't me, right? Wasn't me." And as they back up, they see this woman that's sitting there, that's been bleeding for 12 years. By the way, notice the 12 too. One's at the end of her life. One's been suffering her whole life and is about to experience life for the first time. And they begin to back up, but she's weak. She's tired. She can't get up. And as they back up even more because they see, oh, it's the unclean woman. And all of a sudden, she's fully exposed there on the street. And all she can do is tremble, it says. In the presence of all the people, on display, exposed, fully in front of everyone in the public, she told him why she touched him and how she had been instantly healed. And then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace," or go in shalom. Be delivered. Be saved. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. He said, "Your daughter is dead." He said, "Don't bother the teacher anymore." And here's the difference too. We notice the difference between how she approaches and Jairus's. Because look how Jairus's household views Jesus. He's a teacher. Don't bother the teacher anymore. She sees something otherworldly about Jesus. She sees who he is. Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed." I love ending this story on verse 50. If you know the story, and I'm sure most of you do, you know how it turns out. It turns out beautiful. Restoration comes, Jesus enters the room, and the girl rises to life. But I like stopping the story before that moment, lingering in the unknown, resting only in the promise of Jesus, because that's the place where you and I actually live. We live between the promise of restoration and the fullness of eternal life. We live trusting the words and the promises of Jesus now while we wait in moments that often feel uncertain and mysterious and unresolved. In that space is where we need encouragement for each other. Jesus has spoken. When Jesus speaks, we're invited to hold on to the hope and to anchor ourselves there, even when we can't see how the story's going to end. And that's what Jesus is asking the synagogue leader to do here. Trust me, it's going to be okay. In this story, when Jesus returns from busy ministry journey, he's met with a crowd. And you know what it's like when you come home. Maybe you've come home from work or from church. You're exhausted. You've been running errands. You're met at the door by a child or a spouse, or you get a text from a friend who all of a sudden has expectations on you that they need help with something. And that is this story. Jesus is truly living the human experience. He's been on the road. He's been doing ministry. And he's coming to the place in which he's home for a little bit, and the crowd meets him with tons of expectations. They surround him for a mix of sincere but also selfish reasons. Some wanted healing. Some wanted hope. Some were just curious and had nothing else to do on a Saturday night. And we still do this today. There are times in prayer when we encounter God in prayer that we're approaching God with mixed motives. We gather around Jesus sometimes, even at church, with mixed motives, hoping that he will give us what we think we need to fix what we think our problem is. And there's two things I want to point out right away about this story. Sometimes the moments when people need encouragement the most are the very moments in which we already feel overwhelmed and depleted ourselves. That's just reality. Jesus is probably depleted, but that's the moment where God is expecting to do something. And sometimes the ways people come to us are shaped by a mix of sincere need and misplaced expectation, but that does not cancel the call to respond with grace. That's one thing Jesus does well. He's not exhausted enough to not respond with grace. And then Luke introduces us to the synagogue leader. He's a man at the end of his rope. His daughter is dying. He's run out of options, and he crosses over to the dark side. And this is what I mean by that. Think about this. This is a man who belongs to the Jewish leaders. He's a Jewish teacher. Jewish teachers and Jesus aren't getting along so far in this story. He's called him some pretty offensive things that would equate to swear words almost today. The Pharisees and the teachers, the leaders of the synagogues, have a hard time accepting Jesus. But right here, This man is at the end of his ropes, as most of us would be if our kids were sick and there was nothing else to do. He falls at his feet and pleads with him. He gives him a Hail Mary prayer, like many of us are going to be doing in the Eagles game, I'm sure, later today when the 49ers are looking better than we are. Jesus, get me out of this. You've done this, and I've done this. Help me here. If you do this, I'll never do this again, right? We often lead in our prayer life with petition. I need blank. I need daily bread here and now. However, by the way, when Jesus teaches us to pray, it rather starts as a theological realignment. God the Father, holy is His name. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Then we get to the petition. But here we see people coming petition first, as we often do. And that's the difference I see between the synagogue leader and the woman. She believes in Jesus' greatness. He's merely reaching out to the end of his hope. And Jesus answers both prayers, by the way. But we must be careful with how we come to Jesus and for what end. Now Jairus begins to beg Jesus to come to his home. He's pleading. Actually, he's continually pleading and begging. I see a good imagery there. You know, when Jesus teaches on prayer, he says you need to ask and seek and knock. And what it implies is the Greek, you need to keep asking. You need to keep knocking. You need to keep seeking. And that's what Jairus is doing. Please, God, right posture. Probably wrong intent. He's doing just that. But he has a specific outcome in his mind. He wants Jesus to act on his timeline and his way. And I've often found, I don't know about you, God often answers in a completely different way than I'm praying, or in a way that I don't expect. This might be because the encouragement we think we need is different than the encouragement we actually do need. Why don't I think Jairus believes that Jesus is Messiah and that he's coming with wrong intention? Because we get introduced to him not only as a synagogue leader, but as someone who's looking at Jesus as teacher. But God can even honor that when we come to him with wrong posture, that he can show up and show off in our lives. Jairus is simply trying to get the easy option, and as any good parent would when a child's in danger. But it tells us this: the answered prayer or encouragement you want may not be what God knows you need. Jairus is going to get his answer, but it doesn't look like the way he wants it. He's going to experience loss and grief and mourning before he gets celebration and a beautiful story of restoration. What stands out is who Jairus is praying for me, though. He's pleading on the behalf of his daughter, and I'm convinced that God often honors the prayers for others much more than he does the prayers we do for ourselves. Even in the Lord's Prayer, when he teaches us to pray, think of the plural language, our Father, right? Forgive us. Give us your daily bread. And we have a deliver us. There's this plural aspect where we're remembering each other as we pray. One of the ways that encouragement gets practiced is our intercession for others. It's important for us to be focused on others. Faith pulls us beyond ourselves, and I think we see that here. Now, as Jesus begins to go to Jairus' home, Luke says they're nearly crushing him, and the crowds are unreliable. They are present when hope feels close, but they'll disappear when the moment turns into suffering. And then Luke kind of scans the scene. He moves the cinematic picture to another person, a woman who has been suffering for 12 years. And unlike the crowd, she can't surround Jesus. She just believes something about him. She believes that if she can just touch the edge of his cloak, that she'll be healed. And that's belief. That's faith. Faith is not just something you think or that you know, it's something you do. Faith, the word for it, pistis in the Greek, implies that it's faith as experience, belief as experience. As you step out, you experience God. She acts on belief that she will experience her answer. Now imagine how Jairus felt in that moment. He was headed to his house. He had high hopes that Jesus was going to heal his daughter. Time was of the essence. And then Jesus stops to let someone else win. Have you ever been praying about something, really pleading out to God about it, and all of a sudden, the thing you're praying about, you see someone around you get it. You see them win in a way that you've been praying about, and it can be hard in those moments to feel joy. Like other people are winning or getting. God, don't you love me? Don't you care? There's something else beautiful about that in this story. In a worldly way, Jairus should have been the one God was answering the prayer of. He's a synagogue leader. If that synagogue leader could be convinced of Jesus' power, would all the Pharisees and other synagogue leaders all of a sudden take a different form of Jesus? The whole world could experience him. But Jesus doesn't choose to go and be present with people of power and prestige, of role and responsibility. Jesus chooses to be present with the woman everyone overlooks. The challenge is not to lose faith when it feels like others are winning and we are still waiting. Or to put it in another way, we need to be encouraged by the way others are experiencing Jesus, not discouraged. We need to be encouraged by the way others are experiencing Jesus, not discouraged. Jesus also shows us that we need to be interruptible, to be able to encourage others in everyday life. And even when we're already busy doing good work, the person with power and prestige is waiting while Jesus fully chooses to be present in that moment with someone who's alone and undervalued and forgotten. Jesus, in doing so, shows us something really important about the heart of God. God's attention isn't earned. God's attention isn't pulled to you by having more power or prestige or being more important or looking better in some way. God's compassion is not rushed by urgency, but rather by what God's doing in a moment. Jesus is interruptible, and interruptions really reveal who he is. We are called, too, to encourage people based on God's leading, not the position that they hold. We don't get to analyze, where do I spend my time? We pay attention to what God's doing in a moment. When this woman exhausted, reaches out and touches Jesus, everything stops. Who touched me? And I shared a little bit of this, but I imagine something important is happening. As the crowd realizes who touched Jesus, I picture them quickly backing away, backing off, creating space onto this weak, unclean, lonely woman who who probably hasn't experienced any spiritual services like synagogue or the healthy touch of another person for years, is left fully exposed on the side of the street alone. Tells us those who need encouragement the most are often those emotionally exposed and those living in the shadows. Everyone knows what she represents. According to the law, she's unclean. According to the crowd, she's the problem. Perhaps there's sin in her life. She has lived 12 years, probably since her teens, with an exhausting health problem. Without synagogue or spiritual practices to anchor. She's not experienced community or friendship or human touch. She is lonely. Her parents are probably passed at this point, and she's living on the goodwill of others who pass her. And based on the crowd's reaction as they pull back and she's the only one left there realizing she can't hide anymore, she's someone they avoid. They pull back, leaving her there. But Jesus doesn't step back. He steps forward. Encouragement is about taking the time to be interrupted, stepping closer, simply being present with them. He doesn't recoil. He doesn't rush. He doesn't say, why are you bothering me? I'm busy. He doesn't say, I'll come back to you. She's not going to die. Jairus' daughter is going to die. He doesn't say, I'll come back to you when I'm done with this other more important thing. He's interrupted in the moment. Instead, he creates space for her to be seen. He speaks to her. He calls her daughter. She probably hasn't heard that word in a long time. She probably hasn't experienced the tender voice that he modeled to her in forever. Daughter. And in that moment, he speaks a word of restoration over her. These are not the rushed words. They're present words. They're healing words. They're words of intimacy. And sometimes encouragement is simply offering presence and healing words to other people. What people often need, or what they think they need, isn't actually what they need the most. Think about this for a minute. In Acts, there's a story of John and Peter. They're walking into worship, and as they go into the temple, there's a beggar, and he says, look, can you spare a few coins? And in that moment, they flip their pockets inside out and they say, sorry, it's a cashless society. We don't really carry cash anymore, and try to get away from this guy. No, that's not what they say. They say, look, we don't have money, but we do have something you need. The thing you need isn't actually the coin. We can pray with you. It's an act of presence. We can be present with you. The man thinks he needs money. They know he needs prayer in Jesus. They know he needs presence. So they stop and they pray for him. And he's healed. Healing words are what we often need. And in this story that we read this morning, healing words were what were needed. Jesus refers to her as daughter. That's the kind of healing she needs. That's the kind of healing that comes from him being present with her. It's the kind of healing that comes through a touch of restoration. I imagine he helps her up. This is the kind of healing that she needs. Encouragement is about rightly placed words. And all of this is happening while Jairus is watching, perhaps even beginning to steam at this point. You guys remember Popeye? Remember when he'd get really mad, there'd be like smoke that come out of his head, and he'd get really bright red, and then he'd have to eat a spinach so he could take on Pluto, right, or Brutus, depending on what version of the Popeye story you watch. But that's how I picture Jairus. The crowd's backed away. Jesus has stepped away from him and towards an unclean woman in the middle of the street, which is questionable in itself for Jesus to walk towards a woman in the middle of the street. And Jairus is sitting there like Popeye, and there's smoke billowing out of his side. And then the worst news arrives, if this isn't bad enough. Your daughter's died. Don't bother to teach her anymore. In that moment, I imagine there's this mix of anger, confusion, loss, mourning, grieving that begin to flood his heart. And in there he's, God, don't you care about me? God, I'm serving you in the synagogue. God, I'm all about your mission. Why do you not care? Why didn't you act sooner? Many of us know that moment. And in that moment, delay feels like abandonment, doesn't it? And that's how we often think is the case. We need encouragement, and it feels like absence. But I imagine Jairus falling to his knees. And Jesus speaks again, don't be afraid, just believe. That same faith that healed the woman is now going to go to his house, and he's going to bring it. But Jesus shows us that the deliverance and healing are brought through believing. Not believing in outcomes, but believing in him. God doesn't write rushed stories. The woman is healed in a moment, seemingly. But don't forget something. She's had 12 long years of suffering. She has waited and waited on God. Jairus has waited too, wondering why it seems like everyone around him is getting what he needed. But the story isn't over. He just has to wait. And they say, waiting is the hardest part. At least that's what Tom Petty used to say. Jesus shows us that the stories he is writing are never rushed. He's not in a hurry, even when we are. Faith is actually formed in the waiting, and trust is often forged in the interruption. And Jesus also in this story shows me that it's hard to understand what Jesus is doing, because I would be bothered if I was Jesus. Yet, often, like the synagogue leader, I can't see the full picture. And neither can we always. It's easy to lose heart when bad news comes. And this is why we need encouragement. Jesus again shows us that encouragement is about what we say to each other in the rough moments. But Jesus reveals something else too. Power, the healing, miraculous power of God comes out to those who believe. Not to the crowd, not to the individuals that come with their wishes, but to a woman, to a child. Belief is the doorway. But there's also a warning here. We must be careful how to approach Jesus. Faith isn't entitlement. We think of him humbly, trusting him, rather than trying to manage him. And there's promise. Jairus is about to get what he wanted. However, he's going to get more. He's actually going to get what he needed. He thought he needed a healing, and he could trust that much for Jesus. But he's actually about to see the true power of God at work. And he would have missed out on that if things would have went his way. He's about to get a full look at who Jesus is. God is never interested in a small game. He's interested in what it takes to give us what we need the most. Faith is learning to trust the story God is writing. And sometimes faith looks like passing through a crowd, and sometimes it looks like us reaching for a tassel with whatever strength we have left, and sometimes it looks like we're standing even when Jesus seems distracted with others. And sometimes following Jesus means paying attention to those around us who are reaching with what little strength they have and being present with them in affirming ways. And Jesus also shows us that transformation often happens in stages. The woman's bleeding stops, but then in a little bit he's going to declare, you are fully healed or you are fully restored. Recovery is a journey. Wholeness takes time. And the crowd exposed her, but they couldn't have embraced her and encouraged her in the same way that Jesus did. And that's the power of the church. We have the power to embrace and encourage each other in the way that they should have. And if you're struggling this morning, Jesus' words to Jairus remind us of our responsibility. Just believe. Faith is not passive. It's active trust. It's a reminder that God writes slow chapters for our own good. We're invited to see that when we can be interruptible for others, as Jesus was for this moment, where can we do that? 2, we're thinking we must remember that our prayers do interrupt Jesus. He hears them even when we're standing on the sidelines like Jairus. And faith is acting on what we know God is capable of. It's simply taking that step. And perhaps you need that encouragement this morning of what Jesus gave Jairus. And I'm going to read it to you from the Message version, just to introduce it to you in another way. And it reads like this, and let this be God's words to you. Jesus overheard and said, don't be upset. Just trust me, and everything will be all right.